Hello, everybody. Welcome to the farm, January 17th. Tonight's special guests are Dr. Allen Greenfield, ritual magician and author of Secret Cipher of UFO Knots, as well as Secret Rituals of the Men in Black, and several other books on the topic, as well as Paul Weston, author of Aleister Crowley and the Aeon of Horus, a book featuring extensive consideration of ufology and high strangeness, including the secret cipher mentioned in Hellier and above in Allen's authored books. Also featuring Steven Snider of Vicep, as usual, and yours truly, Mr. Frank Zero of Zero Night. That knowing stare, that parental flare of affirmation, is all Roddenberry needs to journey back into the place in his gut that drove the show. All he needs to stare down the demons that would pervert his vision in the name of sales. This is Jack Kirby, having been worn out by the agents of the Archon, silencing what for him was natural vision, the very breath of his drawing style engaging a new kind of vigilantism, a new kind of ever so constructive anger. This is Thor, leaping from the pages of his work to battle Nazis who would pervert his father's name and snuff out his illuminating thunder flame. These men left us with legions of gods. Odysseus would shudder after being put through the alchemical spiritual test of Kirby's characters, and he would weep endlessly in the air of one Vulcan mind link. So our heroes were evolving. Like us, they were learning to be more human and at the same time taking on larger, more alien problems. Like us, they were becoming more resilient. They are but symbols, but more than any other medium, they insisted we could be stronger. The Black 2001 Space Odyssey monolith speaks volumes in the sight of its actual appearance. Forget conspiracies. Here before you stands the Stargate. Contact is certain. Evolution is certain. Survival is not. As we put on our silly human spacesuits and swallow our silly human drugs, she is there. Does it matter if we lose this horse, this vessel, this me? Are we going to be assimilated in some brave new nightmare predicted to us with anyone happening to have Wells in their name in literary circles from the ancient past? Is this the mysterious Borg cube, a testament to our adult reactions becoming more reactionary and less formative, the Decepticons, the Allspark cube, or is this the plan of some comic book post-Nazi with a cosmic cube? Is this the rectangular UFO littered through so many cases, our four-sided confining box? Viewing in three dimensions becomes the six-sided hexagon, a perfect prison for a mind. But screw the personal. This was a cubicle for a world. Its chaperones appearing more and more robotic each day. In dark underworlds, the strings are pulled by men in cold blue and black, the men from Dark City. But who does their work? After Kubrick's least known picture, Apollo 11, he responds apparently rather disturbed with Clockwork Orange, running around, traumatizing and being traumatized. Are the demons that brew in these men instead the greys and reptilians themselves? Does this mysterious block indicate certain death or torture? Are the archons inside us, speaking for us, or just calibrating our history to their draconian timeline? I had a few more paragraphs to that, but I'm just gonna stop it there. I just thought that would be cool. That's actually from the script of my comic book A Star, where I blended a lot of magical ideas and mythological ideas. So, Stephen, did you want to start off with some questions for our special guest?
Sure, absolutely. I wanted to do a couple of, obviously our main topic of interest here is going to be Hellier, but there were a few questions I had for Alan that I been kind of dying to ask him for many years. I did first discover your work through the book that you wrote called The Secret Rituals of the Men in Black, and specifically the things that you have written about the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, more commonly known as the Knights of Malta. This is a particular subject of particularly great interest to me. And I was especially struck when we were talking just a few minutes ago when you mentioned that you had had a few meetings with General Douglas MacArthur towards the latter days of his lifetime. Is that correct?
Yeah, that would be circa 1960-61 when I was just getting involved in, well, all of these things, really. You can perhaps make some sort of Freudian pubescent thing, but my interest in the occult and in UFOs and in things that go bump in the night all stem from that same period, early 1960s, and that was the end of General MacArthur's life. I interviewed a lot of people during that period, trying to get my own fix on what these things were all about, but Donald Kehoe was another one. I have no fix on where he was really coming from, except that he lived right above the Luray Caves in Virginia. And MacArthur was one of them. Great man, mixed bag. That's
absolutely. So it is true then, obviously, in some of the published comments it made, there were indications that he did have a keen interest in UFOs, but there's obviously been a lot of speculation from UFOologists for years about the extent of this. So you can confirm then that he did have quite an interest in the subject then.
Well, we got yes, but we got off on, or at least he was interested in the nuts and bolts version, which was what I accepted back then, of UFOs being extraterrestrial visitations, and he thought that was quite possible. But he also seemed to have something of an interest in the, you have to get back into the mentality of the times, but the military implications, allegedly. Not so much of any kind of alien invasion, but the fear that UFOs would set off, as it did in 1952, according to Dewey Fournay, who I also interviewed, that there would be a UFO flap that would distract people, and the Russians would come in and bomb us while we were chasing flying saucers. That was the CIA's concern, and I guess maybe he was consulted on that. I don't know. I mean, he was, after all, very anti-communist.
Absolutely. And that brings me up to my second question here. I'm curious if you've ever heard or encountered of a rather peculiar group that has had various titles over the years. Officially, they've typically gone by the name of the Sovereign Order of St. John of Jerusalem. Sometimes they're referred to simply as the Shikshini Knights of Malta, after the town in Shikshini, Pennsylvania, where they had their headquarters for many years. I ask because quite a few of the military officers in there, including General Charles Willoughby, had served either with or alongside MacArthur in either World War II or Korea. Willoughby specifically had been MacArthur's intelligence chief in both World War II and Korea. Did you have any encounters with this group?
Not directly, but I have heard them referred to repeatedly in a number of different contexts. The most interesting to me historically is that the Maltese Knights are direct descendants of the Knights Templar. I'm not sure that the Templars aren't overblown in history because of the ugly way in which they were suppressed, but there is a connection there. There's also a connection with the rights of Memphis and Mitzrayim, which is something that I have written extensively about, because Cagliostro was allegedly spending a great deal of time in the late 1700s with the Knights of Malta, who purportedly were heirs to the Egyptian, ancient Egyptian religion as practiced in the Hermetic Brotherhood of Light. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, it's most of that, however, unlike a lot of the stuff that I talk about, is secondhand knowledge. It's not like I was a member, I'm not a Catholic, I'm Jewish. So,
well, actually, you could have actually gotten into the Shikshini Knights of Malta without out being a Catholic. They were actually multi-denominational, and from what I can tell, they had quite a keen interest in UFOs and other New Age stuff. Of course, one of the members was Colonel Philip J. Corso, who would go on to write The Day After Roswell, and another really interesting one was a guy named Cleve Baxter, who was their quote-unquote interrogation specialist. Baxter had been in the Army Counterintelligence Corps and the CIA, and I've actually just recently unearthed a collection of his personal documents, ironically from the University of West Georgia, which is near the Atlanta area, and there's some really crazy stuff in there, and I got a good laugh actually from some of the documents I saw this morning in relation to the interview you did with Terry Rist and the secret rituals of the Men in Black. I think at the end of that, Mr. Rist had said something to the effect that the Knights of Malta would give up their fortunes to know the Reiching methods methods and orgone methods that he was using at the time. And it just so happens the Shinny Knights of Malta by the late 70s actually had somebody in their membership roles who was a specialist in this type of thing, specifically. But yes, it was really quite crazy, and yes, long time interest in that topic. So getting into the stuff with Hellier.
Can I stop you for just a minute before we wander away from that? Sure. When I make reference to the Knights of Malta, it's the original Catholic League based in Malta, not the Shikshimi, the American. It's like talking about the difference between the Society for Psychical Research and the American Society for Psychical Research, or whatever. There are distinctions and different lineages and different. It's like the entire, if you want to call it, the ceremonial, magical, Masonic, occult universe. There are many claimants to be the original, but my reference was to that. However, I will say this and go back to Terry, who I really wish I had done better at this point, considering the ruckus about him. He would bring the subject of the Knights of Malta up when we talked about, for lack of a better term, spooky stuff, whatever spooky stuff it was. And apparently it was something that was he was much better informed about. He never said he was, involved with it or a member of it, but he talked about that in much the same way that a lot of people talk about the Trilateral Commission or whatever. He was, when I knew him, part of this very left-wing group that I was also part of, but some of his ideas would be reflected now in the new right and or the, one might say, crazy right. And his knowledge was greater than mine, or at least his perceptions of what they were all about were far greater than mine. Mine was just, at that point, how does it link up to this other stuff? And I was interested in the Cagliostro back then, as I am now, and the fact that there was an association there on Malta at one time in the 1700s was my main focus. It was not on descendant bodies today. So I hope that clarifies it a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should have clarified that as well, that the Shikshini one is basically a pseudo Knights of Malta that has no... Well, they claim that they actually were descended from the Russian connection, but that's, very debatable. And they certainly don't have any direct connections to the historic sovereign military order of Malta. I have to ask, though, in terms of like the original order, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, did you ever encounter any of accounts of what happened after they absorbed the Order of St. Anthony or the Hospital Brothers of St. Anthony in 1777? I know there's a lot of traditions that they had actually practiced some use of entheogens through orgots or something like that.
Only that I've heard exactly the same thing from miscellaneous sources, none of which were firsthand. So in my experiences, again, probably not as good as yours in that particular area, simply because it's all second, third, fourth, fifth hand, like a lot of these things are.
Okay. Well, okay, let's get into Hellier then a little bit. So you've seen the second season of the documentary now, correct?
Oh, yeah, multiple times.
Okay. There's a guy in there that they interview, I think, a little after midway through it. His name is Vaughn, and he also claims that he had met Terry Rist, or as he knew him, a Terry Reist, or something to that effect. And he claimed that his Terry had been involved with Nord Davis in some kind of connection. Can you confirm that?
What I can confirm is, first of all, Greg Newkirk got in touch with me about that particular thing to say, do you think this is the same Terry? And up until then, I had said they had received some sort of communication from somebody who was describing, somebody who probably had read my books. I mean, as opposed to the guy that I knew. But that fellow that sat down for the interview and then got scared, I don't remember his name, but he knew Terry after I did, and almost all of the things that he said agreed with things that I knew or things that I couldn't comment on one way or the other. So I tend to think that the guy did, meet Terry, although he was, the guy was very young at the time and seemed apprehensive about it. Terry was the only difference, and I told Greg Newkirk about this from, the Planet Weird people, is that my perception was that his politics ran to the direct actionist left, and this guy said that he had been involved in some kind of right-wing militia. However, if he was a kid at the time, I don't know if you could distinguish a right-wing militia from a left-wing militia. During the period in question, I walked around with a T-shirt that I had specially designed that said, Citizens Militia Death from Below, which was, a parody of the airborne death from above thing. So, but of course, I've had all sorts of thoughts in recent days about how much of the Terry that I knew was, he could, it's not like I haven't known other people. In extreme left or right-wing groups, you have to assume that some of the people that you meet are spies. They're either spies for the FBI, or they're spies for some foreign government, usually in those days, the Soviets or whatever. But I'm not saying that Terry was that. I'm just saying that the Terry that he met is personality-wise extremely consistent with what I knew. The biographical facts, such as they are, that he was a Vietnam vet and that he was a tunnel rat, is consistent with what I knew. But what a person's motivations are, you don't know unless you know a person for a very long time. All I know is he made off with my 1940s pulp magazines while I was out of town. All of the Shaver material from the 1940s I had collected, plus a lot of stuff Richard Shaver had given me. He used to send me rocks in manila envelopes that had pictures of the ancient mechs and people and so forth, which you can take either with a grain of salt or take seriously. At the time, I took them very seriously, and I still take them more seriously than a lot of people do. Well, they're all gone because Terry said, "Can I borrow those?" And borrowing was not my forte, because almost nothing I have loaned out in my entire life to date gets returned. That's, there are exceptions, including a couple of really, really, how shall I put it, gentlemanly exceptions. But basically, if I've loaned it out, it's basically giving it. That's the only way that I can do it. But I went down to my hometown to write Secret Cipher, just the bulk of the book. And actually, I wrote Secret Cipher and Secret Rituals originally as one book for Illuminate Press, the late great Illuminate Press. And they wound up being published 10 years apart for complicated reasons having to do with the evils of the alleged ancient Templar order I used to be a honcho in, that will remain nameless, OTO. But the point being that I separated the two books, but the guy seemed authentic. I think that's the bottom line. And there was nothing about that interview that would make me think that it wasn't the same guy. Maybe different perceptions of him, but the same guy.
It's
years later.
It's interesting to me because certainly you had generally depicted Terry as kind of being involved in more radical left-wing activity, whereas him being associated with Nord Davis, it gave me a very different perspective, because Nord Davis was tied in with the whole Christian identity movement. I'm sure you probably heard of it, though, for the listeners who are not familiar with it. It's a rather toxic ideology that was sort of based partly on British Israelism, that has white Europeans essentially as the actual Jews, and in the identity strand, essentially the real Jews are almost depicted as subhuman beings and so forth. And yes, it's quite a toxic ideology. And on top of that, Nord Davis was involved in a organization called the Civilian Material Assistance in the late 1980s. And this group was actually directly involved in funding the Contras in Nicaragua and so forth. And another interesting individual that was tied up in that came up in the FBI's PATCOM investigation in the early 90s was John Grady, who at the time was the Grand Master of one of the descendants of the shady Knights of Malta. So there does kind of seem that this, kind of network, Nord Davis was potentially tied up with the shady Knights, which is one of the reasons I kind of brought that question up in the first place. But I did find that quite curious there, that you had just, indicated that potentially Terry could have been a spy of some kind. Knowing that he might have potentially been linked to Nord Davis, who was involved in these, operations to fund the Contras, would that give you maybe more of a sense of that?
Well, let me put it this way. I don't talk very much about my radical political past for reasons that I hope would be obvious in the current toxic climate in the United States. But I will say this as a general proposition. First of all, I have known people from right-wing groups very far, we're talking about very far left and very far right. So uncharitably, you could call them the kook left and the kook right, although that would make me a kook leftist, so I hesitate to do that. First of all, if you can't see it just from the outside, I should say there are similarities between the two extremes. Not with everyone who's involved with it, but people who are especially attracted to violent confrontation or direct action, or however you want to describe it. There are some similarities in the personality attraction of, to put it in today's terms, Antifa and these white supremacist groups. Only that they're both into confrontation and feel their righteousness very strongly. I don't, obviously my sympathies are with one and not with the other, being not the British Israel, but the Israel, the Yehudim. That's, the two ends meet in a certain way, in certain common denominators that people who are intelligent but very alienated tend to, and perhaps have a feeling of being dispossessed, will tend to go to one extreme or the other. And it kind of depends on who they meet first. Harry was kind of an intellectual, so I doubt that he was. If he was a spy, he may have been a spy for the left on the right. I don't know. The circumstance under which he left Atlanta, and he was only here for about 2 years, are not clear to me because as I said, I was 200 miles away writing the two books that we're sort of referencing right now.
Okay.
Which are, by the way, plug, available now for the first time, courtesy of Paranoia Press, as one volume called The Complete Secret Cipher of the Euphonauts. So save money and buy the two together as The Complete Secret Cipher of the Euphonauts from Paranoia Press. And for God's sake, if you buy the book, don't be an armchair enthusiast. Work with the cipher. That's the important part of the book, not the interview, the appendix. It's not unimportant, but it's, if you work with the cipher, stuff happens. Very, very synchronous stuff that gets very, very close to the heart of the mystery of all the things we talk about. Of course, I took huge flack from the occult community, which despises the ufologists, and a little flack from the ufologists who think occultism is all devil worship, which it's not.
So that has the Men in Black, the secret ciphers, and the secret rituals in one place?
Yes, with I believe there's a new introduction by Ola Phillips in there as well. And I'm informed it's selling like hotcakes. But again, I think that's due to a second wave interest in it because of the mentions in Hellier and things adjacent to Hellier.
Certainly. Those books are hard enough to find, guys. You should definitely get them while they're together. I'm sorry, Stephen, were you about to say something?
No, absolutely. I mean, it's a great work. Anybody who's a fan of, the individuals on this podcast should definitely go out and grab a copy immediately. If you haven't already, it's, just a host of really fascinating topics that are discussed and so forth. So, Alan, I had like one more question here before I turn it over to somebody else. All right. So, and God Never Does the Same Thing Twice, you seem to kind of strongly play into the notion of Aleister Crowley as a prophet of the new Aeon and so forth. But, in the second season of Hellier, in your interview there, I believe you had indicated that you no longer practiced Thelema. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Could you please tell us why?
Yeah, I think I can. It partly has to do with my experience with the OTO, because I spent 20 years in the OTO working my way up. They made me a sheriff, aka a Sovereign Grand Inspector General, and I saw a lot that disillusioned me. I'm not the first person nor the last person that's been a product of, but I had to look further. Is there simply a flaw in leadership, as I first thought, which got me booted out because I thought they should change leadership, or was it a flaw in the thinking of Aleister Crowley in setting up the version of that organization that currently exists? Actually, there are multiple versions, but the one that has the legal claim to being the OTO. And I find a lot of flaws in Crowley's thinking. Basically, he's advocating do what thou wilt, meaning something along the lines of live according to your own will. But then in the organization, it is primed for being an authoritarian culture, which involves a ad vitam leadership, which is always corrupt. I don't like it in the Supreme Court. I think that's a relic of monarchy, which is, with all due respect to Scotland, it's not our way over here on this side of the pond, and or shouldn't be. Although, who knows? Maybe Canada will have its own king now. I don't know. But that's for people that keep up with the news and are amused by the royal family of England, which I wish, I think they're good for England. They're great for tourism. But, it's like the British Empire. It's bad for everybody else, just good for the English. But in any case, I digress. I guess where we're going here is that I think that Thelema is a proto-fascist movement disguised as an ultra-libertarian movement. And I am, in practice, a social democrat, but a civil libertarian. I believe in, I'm not a drug user, but I think the government regulation of drugs is ridiculous. I think the number of people imprisoned is ridiculous, and even the idea of prisons is probably a poor deterrent. You can go through the list. I'm civilly a libertarian while thinking that public trust should be those who do the work should own the work.
Well, that's fabulous.
Does that answer your question? Or
yes.
Like
that was
political announcement. I'm announcing my candidacy. Why not? Everybody else is running.
No, that was quite an elegant explanation, and I appreciate that. That's something that some of my other friends and I have discussed for a while, the kind of fascist implications in some of Crowley's ideology and so forth. So I definitely appreciate your insight into that very much. And I guess there I'm going to turn it over to you, Frank. I know that you guys have got a bunch of questions too. You're probably burning to ask Alan and your own stuff. Do you want to get into?
Surely. Let me, Paul, you with us?
Yeah, sure am.
Okay, let me ask you something, man, and then I am gonna set you loose on Alan, and I think that'll be interesting
Uh-oh,
enough by itself. Alan, prepare yourself.
I'm
Um,
prepared.
I figured you would be. Paul, can you, and this might be a bit of a convoluted question, but I've been bringing up the idea of pop culture hypersigils. In the synchro mystic field, we refer to them kind of as mega rituals. But hypersigil is kind of what comes to mind when you think of Grant Morrison's own explanation for Invisibles. It's what comes to mind for me when I think of Alan Moore's Prometheus, Tools Lateralis, Mars Voltas, the Bedlam and Goliath, and Scab Dates. So I think that concept albums that are sort of super focused on explaining to the audience that they're infusing the process of magic into not only the creation of the art, but the sending of the art out into the universe. I've been bringing up that concept over and over, whether it's related to music or different other mediums, comic books, like I said, graphic novels. And in Hellier, it's suggested, particularly when they start thinking about actually talking to Alan, and after they speak with Alan, they're thinking about the idea of the whole documentary, this whole journey being sent on. What's actually produced from that, someone sitting down and watching the two seasons, makes them part of the process and kind of makes them part of the experience and the adventure. And I think that when people start researching, or they'll find that if they start researching or getting interested in things related to Hellier and trying to figure out some of their own personal rabbit holes and what they might be curious about, they might find the universe kind of speaking back to them the way we're all familiar with in synchromysticism in general, but certainly what happens naturally when you kind of ask the universe to be a part of your magic or a part of your art, more importantly here. So do you think that we can draw any parallels between the occult approach and involvement in propaganda and in conjunction with symbolism? Let's say that you write about in World War II, this kind of magical war between the good magicians and the Vril and the Thule and the Black Sun, Einherbe, whatever you consider the Nazi occult side. Do you see any parallels between attention to symbols and the way propaganda is going to go out into the culture and everything? Let's say with the good side or the British side of World War II. Do you see any parallels between that and the way Hellier is kind of being sent out into the universe, or the process of sort of doing personal magic and then sending it out and hoping it has other larger ramifications?
Well, I don't necessarily think that the folks that did Hellier, boy, I wish we had more time because this is a broad question that you're asking. It's not really one question, but about a dozen. And I've got all these things jumbling in my head at the same time. So let me just mention a couple of things. First of all, I think Hellier is not, it's an investigation that has become for the people involved in it if they persist in it. As I said in the second season of Hellier, spotting it, and then some stuff happened that kind of self-validated it, unless I sprouted wings and flew to, where were they, in Arkansas or something, the trees across the road with a balloon at the end of it. I thought, oh, well, I didn't do this, but I did mention it like a couple of hours before that to them, just talking about there will be things in your path, and those balloons, watch out for those balloons. And of course, the balloon that they found there was in the shape of a blue star, and the publisher of my current book, God Never Does the Same Thing Twice, is Blue Star Press, out of California, Sacramento. And I mean, just they're all sort, and the earlier ones, of course, said happy birthday, and I said, that's a wake-up call, But the other thing is, boy, there's just so much information here. I have a free illuminist friend who is chartered for a lodge in, I believe, London area. And she does a type of trance dance that she makes clear, and I've seen her perform it, and I think that you can find them. Her name is Amadali, and you can find them on YouTube and other places, but it's best seen in person. She says the people who watch her perform these dances become part of the mystical conveyance that she is giving out in doing those dances. And I think the same is true for a lot of other things. First of all, I think the division between fiction and nonfiction in the areas that we're talking about it's very dangerous to call something fiction and just leave it alone. I mean, I've been a Philip K. Dick fan since the 1950s. I've read every book that he ever wrote. And that was kind of his major point, yes, that the universe is malleable and we really can't be sure what's real and not real. So when I do research now using the internet and punch in or Google something like portals to other realities, 75%, roughly speaking, just pulling that out of my ears, 75% of what I come up with I have to be careful about, because it's about D&D, comics, fictional tropes, the usual thing, but it reads exactly the same as the real stuff, quote unquote. So there are certain cases that I know of that cross the boundaries between fiction and nonfiction. The whole West Virginia cycle, for example, when the Mothman case, which has some interesting ramifications, first emerged, and Gray Barker, I think, in the Superior version, and John Keel in the more Men's Magazine documentary version explored firsthand, waxed between real events in the nuts and bolts sense, although the nuts and the bolts were somewhat ephemeral when you get up close. That doesn't mean they're not real, it just means that they're ghostly, as were the cryptids there, as were the men in black there, even in my own personal experience there, briefly. And fictional events of the same sort. You get that more from the movie, The Mothman Prophecies, than the book. The movie isn't historically accurate, so to speak, but it is, it does carry the mood of what actually was going on, because it was like there was a merger of two worlds there. And I've said, long before I realized that, I've said for decades, and a few other people, those French researchers, Berger and who was the other guy?
Oh, the guys who wrote The Morning of the Magicians, you mean?
Right, and the more important, I think, but less known book, Secret Vaults of the Earth by Berger, that I highly recommend if you can find it. I mean, you're going to have to probably get it from one of those used book services, but it should be back in print, really. I think they both have passed on, but they make the point that Nazi Germany was an intrusion of, quote, occult fiction into reality. And Carl Jung, even before that, for which he took a lot of flack, rightly or wrongly, basically said the symbolism that the Nazis used was very potent, and that's how it attracted people, because it was archetypal symbolism. So I'm running these different questions together, but bear with me here just for a moment, okay? You talk about the likes of Grant Morrison, which I totally agree with you about, that the better stuff that's being done in graphic format are the modern magical grimoires. And something as contemporary as Hellier is sort of a audiovisual grimoire, and boy, I'm not focused here too well because this really goes in so many different directions. Suffice to say this: when you talk about the ancient mysteries, in what format was the Egyptian Book of the Dead originally written? In the pyramid text, and then later in the coffin text. I'm borrowing here from Jules Pfeiffer, who had this to say about comic books, but they basically, hieroglyphics are proto-comic books. And I think the best of those graphic novels, the best, I'm not talking about, Batman meets Superman and the best 2 out of 3 hand wrestling matches, but things that deal with the occult or things that are occultic are grimoires for invocation. I'll give you one example. I use this example often because I was somewhat privy to it, and there was a wave of UFO cases in Wanaque, New Jersey, way back, I think it was in the 1960s. And at that time, my late friend Jim Mosley, a serious ufologist, but also a prankster, something that the nuts and bolts people can't understand, that you could be both. I think there's no difference between them. I think if you investigate any of these things, you become part of the phenomena yourself. And this case illustrates it. Jim, I knew for 40 years or whatever, from his early 30s until he died at 80-something. I don't think I ever saw him draw a sober breath, and he lit one cigarette off of another. He sort of defied all of the, the expectations, but still, that doesn't mean that one should spend your life drinking and smoking. But he was also a very intelligent person, a Princeton man, blah, 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 very wealthy. In that period, in the 1960s, he had an office in New York, the Saucer News office. Tim Beckley worked there, Gene Steinberg worked there, and they're still very active in each their own way in ufology or related fields. And Gene told me way back, a story now that he seems to have forgotten, but way back he told me that the night that the Wanaque, New Jersey wave started, Gene was in Jim's office or apartment, I don't remember which, in New York, and Jim got rip-roaring drunk and said, I'm going to make a hoax phone call to an arbitrary office of a sheriff in New Jersey. And he looked at phone books and picked out of the phone book, Wanaque, New Jersey, called the sheriff's department and straightened up his voice enough to say, there's a UFO over the Wanaque Reservoir. And then there was, and then there were more, and then there were more. And it was a wave, what we used to call a flap, in a term we borrowed from the Project Blue Book or Project Grudge or Project Sign. I don't know when they started to use that term for a wave of UFO cases, but flap will do, especially with the Mothman stuff. Literally flaps. But when I studied that case, along with other, quote, hoax cases, I've decided there are no hoaxes. Reality is malleable. Reality is not what we think that it is. It's not as if you say, I deny that bullets exist, and if somebody shoots you, you don't get pierced and die. That has actually been tried, so-called bulletproof medicine, by the first Americans, by certain tribal groups in Africa. And when belief meets bullet, belief and person who believes in it dies. It's just the way it is. But that doesn't mean that on the edges of reality, and that's what all of these phenomena are, they're right on the edges of our reality, our day-to-day consensus reality, saying, oh, well, those are fantasy, and Magonia is a myth. What is a myth? Is a myth an untruth, or is it, like Joseph Campbell says, an archetypal truth that is difficult to express in ordinary 5 sense terms? Because we are creatures of the sensory system that we have. And that doesn't mean that that's everything. We have the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which I regard as very important, and probably part of the explanation of what these phenomena are. But it also implies that if you have potent symbolism and use it, you change reality. And that's the basis of all magical work. Chaos magicians grasp that a lot better than the Thelemic community, certainly, but or Wicca, or most of the magic. But they all, to some extent, are trying to alter reality. Bringing reality into conformity with will is the way that Thelemites express it. I would say you're just changing the reality, because reality has a plasticity that is denied by consensus views of reality. It's not, something that you can count on all the time, but it's something that works. And I think that to some extent, when you investigate something, you will become part of the mythological universe. Am I losing everybody deep in the weeds here, or
No,
not?
no, this is great. This is great.
Okay,
Yeah.
let me give you another example that is almost ludicrous, a case I investigated myself, not once but twice. It relates to the Brown Mountain Lights, for which there are an abundance of distant witnesses. There's even an official viewing area, but also there are close-up witnesses. And
Is this the Brown Mountain, by the way, that Terry Riss talks about in the in one of the interviews you did with him?
Yeah.
I guess so. People follow those interviews a lot more closely than I do.
Okay, I just yeah.
Yeah, I think let me see, now you're taxing my elderly mind for a senior moment, but let's see here. I think Terry had been to Brown Mountain, North Carolina, but I was there not with him, but with Jim Mosley and his daughter Betty and Tim Beckley on, I can give you this one. It was Christmas Eve, 1968. How do I remember that so well? Well, that was when the astronauts first circled the moon and came back around reading from the Bible, and that turned out to be a NASA stunt of some sort, to allay people's misgivings about if God meant men to go to the moon, he would have given them green cheese or whatever. But my reaction, having just descended from the abyss on Brown Mountain down this iced over road from the viewpoint as high as you can possibly get, was, we're going to die up here. Betty Mosley, who was like 12 at the time, deserves a better Christmas than this. And we get to Beckley's room, and he turns on the TV while he's talking to his mother on the phone. And the astronauts are just coming around reading the first chapter of Genesis. And I thought, oh God, something has gone wrong, and they're stuck circling the moon until they die. It turned out that they were just discussing life in the universe in a poetic way, which is what Genesis 1 is all about. So anyway, I interviewed twice, once with Gene Steinberg and his then wife Ramona, and once with Jim Mosley and Tim Beckley. Somewhere there's a recording of that interview. And this guy, Lael, he was how shall I put it, a simple country person. He had a place called the Outer Space Rock Shop Museum, which had some miscellaneous items. He reminded me a lot of another contactee, John Reeves. Anyway, he claimed that he had been taken inside Brown Mountain by the beings that actually were behind the Brown Mountain Lights, and then whisked away to the planet Venus. And he had many other adventures while I never took the story in a literal sense. But at some point I realized, hey, I've heard this story before. Not only have I heard it before, I've heard it endlessly, but from sources that I really think Ralph Lale never heard of. There's a Wagnerian opera about going into the Venusberg and experiencing similar things and time displacements, and that dates back to at least to the medieval mind singer Tannhauser, which is who was a real person. How much of the story is real or not? The Venusberg is a real place, and it really is a mountain in Europe, in Germany, or I don't know if it's technically in Germany, but it's in the old Holy Roman Empire territory. Let's put it that way. And it seems to me that the bare bones of Lale's story and the bare bones of that whole mythological cycle, the Tannhauser cycle, is exactly the same. And that brings us back. Are archetypal experiences real in the conventional sense that the desk in front of me is real? Or, well, I almost disconnected us. Or are they real in some other sense? Or are they simply something that is in the unconscious part of our being that gets reproduced over and over again historically? I think some of all of those are true. And
Sure.
That's why I think that there is a blending of the nonfiction with the fictional. So I've gone a long way around here, but I hope I'm clarifying what I think the whole thing is all about. I heard a
Sure.
dog barking.
I did not catch the dog. But yeah, one of the things I was mentioning when I first brought up this idea of hypersigils and blending fiction and magic and things is how Alan Moore created Constantine, but had not yet released the character to the public. So he had written him into Swamp Thing and all. And then he went to a bar one night, and Constantine walked right up to him and asked him if he would follow him out the back through some dark, mysterious alley. And Moore, being Moore, decided to decline his own character. But that brings to mind the whole idea of, tulpas and everything people like to bring up from other belief systems that kind of relate. But one thing I wanted to add to what you were saying about comic books altogether is that one of the first grimoires, so to speak, to sort of translate into comics was Neil Gaiman's very underappreciated books of magic.
Mhm.
I think it's named directly enough, but that was the original Harry Potter. You have this kid with short black hair, just nerdy, and he's got these big goofy glasses or whatever, and of course, he doesn't belong, and he gets an occultist, an expert occultist of some kind, to show him each different layer of reality, whether that be in the magical world or a way to perceive our real world. So everyone from Constantine himself to Dr. Fate, Zatanna, Swamp Thing, the Fae, all have some part in his education and some place to bring him to show him how real, for instance, the land of the Fae is, or the land of the dead with death, or just nature, the magical work that I think stands on its own in a different right to speak to the kind of Gaia mind concept would be Swamp Thing, also by Moore. And so when you put together the British or the UK magicians and their worldview via the vessels they decided to tell us these stories with, first of all, they're always trading characters. So the UK magicians are respectively Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, Warren Ellis, and Neil Gaiman, who just came on my TV on an H.P. Lovecraft documentary out of nowhere the second I said his name. But if you take those UK magicians, you basically cover all of magic, or at least a beginner's course in all the books you get at Barnes& and Noble in one sitting on different types of magic. And that goes really into megalithic Celtic traditions all the way into mixing cyberpunk and technology with magical ideas. So Warren Ellis is more technologically based, but Grant Morrison and Alan Moore kind of cover all the bases. Neil Gaiman's a little more dream realm, poetically versed. And like I said, Warren Ellis will take it in a more technological direction, but they'll trade off Batman or Constantine or X-Men or whatever and bring those magical elements into books that previously had nothing to do with magic, all of which I've really, really enjoyed over the past 2 decades as they've gone from sort of underground, obscure type of writers who just wanted to focus on what they wanted to focus on, something as obscure as magic or Kabbalah, all the way into mainstream stories and forcing those characters like Batman to deal with alternate timelines and multi-dimensionality. For example, in the book Planetary. There was, Paul, I was going to ask a slightly more technical, I kind of brought
By
up.
the way, I do agree
Sure.
with you on that. I think that it was a slow evolution beginning during the last period of science fiction comics for kids and soldiers in the late 1950s, early 60s. Amazing Adult Fantasy comes to mind, which was where Spider-Man was first published. That was sort of the end of the amazing. Well, I think they dropped the adult because it sounded like it was porn rather than a comic book. It was an excellent, I think it was Kirby and Ditko that did that. I don't remember exactly, but I was a subscriber, and I kind of groaned when there was a superhero story at the back. I thought, here's the end of the speculative fiction and into the spandex. But be that as it may, the point is, during the 1960s, there was a transition where a lot of this stuff, at least for a while, was given more credit than it had been in the past. And that is reflected in the fact that if you wanted to continue to publish the comic book Batman, you had to have the Batman, the Arkham Asylum Batman, the Dark Knight, because that was reflective of something much closer to reality. Gotham City became a land of shadows, like you were mentioning the movie, I think it was before the program, but
Dark City.
Yeah, Dark City. Now that's a very dark movie. It's well named, but it is sort of only you find at the end that it's an experiment in space, but it's like the version of our everyday reality that I live in, and that a lot of researchers live in. It's dark-sided, but not necessarily evil. It's informative, and the same has been true in the graphic story universe. I try to avoid the term comic because I don't think there's anything funny about it. I confine that to the funny animal Karl Barks era, but the graphic story format is a potent symbol that reaches an audience that otherwise wouldn't be reached. But also role-playing games, LARPs, the entire thing that blurs the line between conventional reality and a broader perspective on the secret commonwealth, as it is sometimes called. Yeah, I'm just saying that that bridging that is something that you find in multimedia. And as I said, I have to be careful what I quote from the internet now, because you have to look at the wiki on it to see whether it's something from a fantasy game that I haven't heard of, or it's whether it's Skyrim or the UFO Hunter. They're
Certainly. And I think it's worthwhile to take a look at two completely different approaches. If we just stay with comics, for instance, Alan Moore takes the approach when he writes a book and when he researches a book, the traditional approach of reading everything about it and getting every interview you can, mastering a topic, and then bringing it in a very, very thorough, detailed outline to an artist to turn into a vision you have to try to show people about a secret or a hidden world or a hidden truth. Whereas the opposite approach is something much more raw and primal that I find in all pulp media. So you can track back that magical period you were just mentioning in comic books, the sort of Ray Palmer, Richard Shaver, Amazing Stories, Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and L. Ron Hubbard, as well as Philip K. Dick, are bound to be in every other issue sort of era. And then when you look at the people who produce this kind of pulp work, I think there's two people you can compare really quickly, and they're two of my favorites my entire life. But as you mentioned, Philip K. Dick, and as Christopher Knowles has written about so eloquently, repeatedly, Jack Kirby. Now, these are both two people who are amazing visionaries, but what they're actually doing on a daily and weekly basis is trying to pay bills by churning out an inhuman amount of work. So rather than study and focus on one idea, let's say like Jack the Ripper, and coming up eventually with something you're sharing with an artist that's a very detailed bit of research besides the comic experience, like From Hell is, the opposite of that is somebody who doesn't have any time and isn't doing any research and is constantly just churning out pages in Philip K. Dick's case and pages of art in Jack Kirby's case. Now, when you stop paying attention to all the detail and you stop trying to force something very, very particular and having to get it right, and rather you're just drawing thousands of pictures a day to get the thing done on a deadline, or you're writing science fiction stories by the hundreds of pages as fast as you can, like I said, to pay the bills, you tap into something else. And it's something as genius as Valis or the idea of the mother box or OMAC or anything that Jack Kirby came up with. But I think what Jack Kirby was doing was much more akin to, there's something hieroglyphic about it, and there's something very cave art, impressionist, taking pop art to a level where it's expressing things besides the actual forms that you meant to draw. So then while Jack Kirby is spacing out and just trying to get as many pages done for Marvel as he can a week or a month, that's how you start getting to faces on Mars and the megaliths on the moon of Jupiter and Titan, and on structures and deep military underground bases on the moon, Mars, and in the States, run by companies that sound like Rand, but it's brand, and you have like a letter off on all this identification for military industrial type of stuff and black projects, but you're tapping into things that NASA wouldn't release for another 20 or 35 years. Now, both Philip K. Dick and Jack Kirby on a monthly basis would correctly predict the future, would get at the heart of some deep occult truth that you would have to be in some particular secret society to know, at least in that time, in that decade, and then prophesy other things about socio-political conditions, about politics in general, about parapolitics, about war, and all these other different aspects of what's going on in our culture, but you're not meaning to. So Alan Moore has the super rich, evolved socio-political views that he puts in something like Watchmen, that he really, really, really thinks out to the umpteenth level and knows that a false flag alien invasion might be part of the true Illuminati's cards if you believe in something so silly. And then you have someone like Werner von Braun, who's actually working on our space program, was in the SS, and tells researchers on his deathbed and years before he died that everything he got came from up there. And that'll get to a part of a question I'm asking about the Vril and Maria Orsic downloading alien ideas. But von Braun, as I mentioned on the show, had a best friend who decided not to be a Nazi. And when he moved here to escape the entire Nazi movement, he began churning out science fiction at the same kind of level that Jack Kirby was, astonishingly enough, getting the same truths through that no one would have been able to tell him for instance, from NASA. So ideas about tetrahedral crystalline structures and faces on Mars, and again with the pyramids on Mars and everything like that. Willy Ley, which was von Braun's friend, would put in many of the adventures of Tom Corbett, Man in Space, which was like his flagship sci-fi thing, but then he wrote in a lot of those amazing stories and everything else. So there's something going on, and then years later we would discover that maybe Jack Kirby did have a friend in NASA that was passing him some secretive information. He certainly had some kind of intelligence ties, besides the things that he was intuitively tapping into, the way that I'm almost definite Philip K. Dick did innocently, without joining any secret societies, without taking anyone's prescribed journey. He would come to ideas which you can cross-reference with all of the visionaries waking up at that time. So Philip K. Dick, John C. Lilly, Robert Ann Wilson, William S. Burroughs, all of these people have some kind of solid state intelligence. ECHO, that's the Earth Coincidence Control Office put forth by John C. Lilly, which is the equivalent to Valis, which is the equivalent to this kind of Gnostic female artificial intelligence we see in a lot of science fiction that opposes the narrative of some time-traveling quantum AI-based. Somehow they came up with the Nazis, traveled time, made sure the Nazis would happen, and later traveled time and created the internet. Something to do with the Fourth Reich, and if it was led initially by AI or alien ideas, or a government that was eventually going to pretend that predator drones and weird footage they're going to put on Fox that mirrors Independence Day or a big Hollywood film like that we've been predictive programmed to death to believe in. I don't know where I was in that sentence, so I'm just going to stop there. But it's this idea that you're creating pop art, and you're creating art that people would even call disposable because it comes with that word pop. If it's popular, that means it's just going to be here for a day. It's 5 minutes of fame. It's going to be thrown out. You have to create something new for the next day, whether that be a new issue of Spider-Man, or whether that be a completely different science fiction novel Philip K. Dick would somehow come up with that had, 10 other strange ideas hidden in it that would later be our collective truth, whether it be about a space station or a type of medicine or whatever. Does anybody want to comment on anything I touched base on there? I know I jumped around probably an annoying amount.
I think that
I'd like to say about the fact that, first of all, with the comics, and as we move into Hellier itself, it's really a case of the Marshall McLuhan-esque idea that the medium is the message. With Hellier, the internet is now the vehicle for magic and synchronicity. External forces can use it. This whole thing, what makes this thing very distinct and unique now, and why it's so interesting, is that it's being played out in the era of emails and mobile phones and Amazon and YouTube, and it develops in a way that previous great magical epic sagas never could, because feedback and interaction and the generation of new material can happen at a rapid rate, and you can have widely disseminated discussion. Crowley, you can't imagine him tweeting and vlogging and posting pics from the Enochian episode in the Algerian desert featuring Coronzon. There wouldn't have been articles and podcasts and videos following on from within months of that, and tens of thousands of people engaged with it. The intelligence behind Hellier is making use of the modern forms for a reason. There will be something that comes out of this that is unique to this period of time and is uniquely collective. And the signature of that, the thing that I find how that's worked, is the point that I raised with you guys beforehand, that Hellier Series 2 premiered on November the 29th, which is the 333rd day of the year. Now, I don't believe that anybody involved with the show chose that date deliberately, but it is a huge number in Crowley studies. It represents Coronzon as a dweller on the threshold of the abyss and messes people's heads up big time with lies and dispersion and madness. He stands on the portal of Darth, which in Kenneth Grant's system is the entry to the cliffotic averse tree that he calls the Tunnels of Set, where the Lovecraftian dudes hang out. And I get the feeling that the cave portals, the tunnel systems that are in Hellier, potentially give an entry to those kind of realms, and that understanding them is useful. But the thing is, the major point is, you have this very strange sense of an external intelligence that is manipulating the format, the medium. And, 333, very interesting. If you look on the secret cipher, I think there's over 100 results that you can get from that. I mean, it's not initially in that format. It's something that's in the usual Gematria, but you can get things like I am the secret serpent out of it. It's all part of, the comics, the mythos that you've been discussing is very much something that's come out at the same kind of time. It's reached its peak at the same time as the ufological era. And now that we're really into the internet and the extent of all this interaction, it's clear to me that some mysterious great intelligence is working its way through this process and using the forms to actually manifest itself.
Surely. Yeah, Paul, that's what I was going to ask you. Actually, what you just said sets up what I was going to ask you a few minutes ago. So before we leave World War II, Alan or Paul, either you guys can, or both you guys can answer this. I feel you might both have something to say. Do you guys personally have any experience with the kind of magical results and the kind of details that, let's say, Maria Orsic, working for the Vril, got thousands of pages downloaded into her mind, supposedly from Aldebaran, one in Old German and one in a language that she didn't even speak, I think like Babylonian or something. It was like some strange glyphs or characters. Now, those blueprints allowed the SS to build the Hannibal and the Vril 1 and 2. So effectively, 3 actually functioning flying saucers, one of which took off from Prague and crash landed back into Prague. So they didn't all work perfectly, but a lot of technical data, other examples of that level of technical download, let's say, is Paul Laffaley's art or the Rendlesham case and the binary involved. If you guys don't like those examples, I can probably fetch some other ones. But if you know what I'm talking about.
With Maria Orsic, you're presenting that as if it's established history. I've yet to find any references to any of this earlier than about 1980. I find that stuff tentative, shall we say. Certainly the Rendlesham thing is very, very interesting. You'll have to talk to Andrew Collins about all that sometime. I mean, he's been led around the world into Chinese mountains playing with all that and getting spectacular results, but that's his story to tell.
Surely. I would look at Joseph Farrell's book about propaganda. It's called Saucers, Swastikas, and something, for a lot of the paperwork and the actual documentation of how close Maria's ideas got to the technical aspects of people who would have been, working with von Braun, working on aerospace projects. It was enough to convince me, but it could be wrong and, not go further back than the 80s. I know the timeline that you're talking about.
Let me say a few things about that, because I tend to agree with the cautionary note while thinking that the basic idea is correct. You asked if if we had any experiences of this sort, and I certainly have. Not so much that it's my experience, but that people that I work with have had those experiences to the point that they actually have gotten very concerned about it. The first computer program back in the day, it had to be done on a mainframe called Lexicon, which was the handy-dandy way of decoding using the New Eon English Kabbalah, was done by the late Tim Coutet, who took his own life. He was too smart for this world, I guess, and was not appreciated. He was a friend of mine of sorts, and he was my second wife's second husband's So there's an incestuous quality to these circles, I'm afraid. But in any case, Tim had a program which I think now will not work on any modern machine, which is unfortunate. So for a few years, I was able to use that. And fortunately, there are other programs now that can be used to compare the cipher to Liber-Al or to the other Class A documents, if you buy into the Thelemic canon being more important than others. But I've seen people work with things as diverse as Ulysses. That's just what you pick as your baseline book is somewhat dependent on who you are, not on what book it is. But as long as you're consistent, you probably will come up with good results. But getting back to Tim Coutet, he told me that he was reluctant to give lexicon any kind of public forum because it contained thousands of cipher alternatives, which he feared could be used by the government for nefarious purposes. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I am pointing out that this was a sufficiently advanced system for dealing with a Kabbalistic structure in the English, based in the grid page in Liber-Al Legis, that the creator of the program was afraid that it could be misused by the government, which sort of parallels what you're saying about the Nazi occultism. I have my doubts about the whole secondary accounts of the Vril Society, because I do think that there are neo-Nazi groups in Germany that pump that. And I would want to see something from very early on, from the Nazi era, that verifies that those people were the Vril women actually existed, or whether they were poster girls for some neo-Nazi group currently in Germany, or in Germany when those stories first came out in the 1980s. I've always said about Wicca, show me a copy of the Book of Shadows that predates Gerald Gardner's Ye Book of Ye Art Magical, and I'll believe that it predates Gerald Gardner, but I have yet to have anyone take me up on that offer. Doesn't mean it's not a valid path, but the antiquity of it is something I question, and certainly the antiquity of the Book of Shadows. Likewise, I think the Nazis tapped into something, particularly certain Nazis, certain high-level Nazis.
Right.
Rudolf Hess was a student of Karl Hochschaffer. That's not doubted, and to the end of his life, he said Hochschaffer was the real magician to whose tune Hitler and I danced. And he died at the age of 93. I mean, what more can he? And he died voluntarily, so by his own hand. So he was a crazy old guy, but he had a poetic sense. And so I would take the Maria Orsic stuff with a grain of salt and do further research on it. However, it doesn't mean that the germ of truth isn't there, which is the Nazis were deep into the occult.
Right. If I can speak to that just quickly, there are certainly groups within Germany and the U.S. and other countries who wish to use all of this type of information to sort of prop up what they think Nazi philosophy was and is and should be, and then they take it to exotic extremes by using the kind of Christian fundamentalist reactionary writing on the topic from the 80s and 90s. However, in Joseph Farrell's research, which I've cross-referenced with others' research, they certainly do have reports of German people seeing flying saucers with swastikas on them, kind of badly attempting to fly around buildings before the war started. And that that seems to be added to a body of evidence that says there was something to the Nazi flying saucers. As to whether the occult elements directly tie in, or anyone can really get to the bottom of certain details of that narrative. I agree with you guys.
Yeah, any experimental aircraft in Nazi Germany would have a swastika on it, or an iron cross, or both. And there were certainly experimental aircraft that were circular in shape. We did that too, and didn't work out too well until the what was it, the B-1 bomber, or the B-2, whatever. It looks like a flying saucer. It's an aerodynamically sound shape. However, I've seen pictures of captured circular flying discs that had propellers on the back of them. And of course, if the propellers are in motion, you don't necessarily see propellers, but you might see the swastika if it was going at propeller-driven speeds. I mean, if you've ever seen a replica of a Messerschmitt in flight, the swastika is displayed prominently. And so I'm not going to argue that all of that is untrue. I'm saying be wary, because neo-Nazis in Germany have a self-interest in saying, oh, the Vril Society was all about this. On the other hand, you mentioned Willy Ley, and Willy Ley, in one of the science fiction magazines, I forget which one, in the 1940s, had a bit to say about the Vril Society, and he was very dismissive of it. He said that was basically a group of nuts. So that's...
Yes, he essentially confirmed that they existed, but that's really the only, as far as I know, hard evidence we have. Willy Ley did go on record and said that they existed, but that's really about all we know about them in terms of, from what I understand, can it be, conclusively proven.
The most important thing that is hard fact about the Vril Society is the Nazi Party was formed at a Vril Society meeting. I mean, that is true, but that doesn't
correct me.
mean...
Don't you mean the Thule Society?
I'm sorry, you're right. It is the Thule group. The Thule group, just like Thule Air Force Base.
Okay.
Yeah, you're correct. I do think there's overlap between them, because some of the people who were members of one were members of the other, and they both were absorbed into the Annenberg, I believe, under the Nazis. Everything was absorbed into them. There was a left-wing back to nature group called the Wandervogels in pre-Nazi, in Weimar, Germany, that was absorbed directly into the Hitler Youth. Some of these things are truly bizarre, but I guess you have to understand the period of history that arose in. I'm just saying that post facto, look for stuff that is from that era. And if you don't find it, be skeptical.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, I know you had a lot of really interesting thoughts that you wanted to get into with that. So I kind of wanted to turn it over to you for a second, if you wouldn't mind getting to some of the interesting stuff you had to speak about in our Facebook group.
I want to draw it back to Hellier for sure. And the thing that I really noticed as we got to the end of the second series was it seemed very clear to me that we were moving into Robert Anton Wilson cosmic trigger territory. And this was kind of laid on with a trowel in the final episode, because you literally see them reading from Crowley's Book of Lies and stating how they feel they're on the threshold of some great mystery. They're pondering the chapter featuring Star Sapphire ritual and kind of stalling over what they think it's all about. Now, to remind everybody of Robert Anton Wilson Cosmic Trigger, with a direct quote, I entered Chapel Perilous quite casually one day in 1971 while reading the Book of Lies by the English mystic Aleister Crowley. And Wilson has a kind of revelation that concerns sex magic and how it, along with drugs, is a major feature in this lineage that he ultimately identifies as maybe stretching back to Egypt and Sumeria and ET contact from Sirius and so on. And that revelation happened through chapter 69 of the Book of Lies. And that chapter is actually a commentary on the Star Sapphire. And that really kind of just made it obvious to me that they were likewise trembling on the brink of Chapel Perilous. You know, in researching occult conspiracies, one eventually faces a crossroad of mythic proportions called Chapel Perilous in the trade. Everything you fear is waiting with slavering jaws. But if you're armed with the wand of intuition, the cup of sympathy, the sword of reason, and the pentacle of valor, you will find there, the legends say, the medicine of metals, the elixir of life, the philosopher's stone, true wisdom, and perfect happiness. And there are those without the pentacle of valor who stand outside the door of Chapel Perilous, trembling and warning all who would enter that the chapel is really an insect horror machine programmed by death demons and dripping fetidly with green goo. Now, this is very much the mood that increasingly builds in Hellier as more and more horror stories and strange situations abound. It really seems to me that the team are in that territory as season 2 ends. And if they made themselves aware of everything that pertains to the Cosmic Trigger saga, it might be very useful to them. Sirius has already got a few mentions in Hellier. And Wilson is someone who gets famously primed by a number, in this case 23, and it does actually crop up in many places in the course of series 2. And Wilson finds that the Illuminati investigation opens up into this enormous consideration of secret societies, bad guys, and most important of all, the extent to which ufological high strangeness gels with occultism. They're all part of one big spectrum. And we see, you know, the name Parsons keeps getting flagged in Hellier, even to the extent of it being found carved into the pavement. Now, Jack Parsons is perhaps an even greater devotee of Pan than Crowley, and Pan is so important towards the end of Series 2 of Hellier. Parsons recites Crowley's hymn to Pan at wild parties and rocket launches. Now, to me, it's surely only a matter of time before the Babylon working crops up and Kenneth Grant's now widely disseminated idea that it opened a portal for the UFOs and whatever the hell else, you know. And I feel that the team are being led into what I'm calling an American shadow psychosphere, which has got echoes of the earlier books of Peter Levender's Sinister Forces, Maury Terry's Ultimate Evil, you know, Underground Bases, The Shaven Mystery, a waft of Montauk, the whole enchilada. You know, at one point when they feel they're surrounded by the bad guys, I'm reminded of the 70s movie Race with the Devil. And the thing about all of this, the thing that I think is really important for them, is that there are warning signals. You know, a real test, a real initiatory ordeal can be failed. It can mash your entire life. You know, Robert Anton Wilson's daughter was murdered. Timothy Leary's wife committed suicide on his 35th birthday. His daughter followed decades later. Brian Barrett, who accompanied Timothy Leary on this weird Crowley trip across the Algerian desert, his daughter was killed in a car crash just up the road from where I am here in Glastonbury, UK. Jack Parsons is killed in an explosion. You know, the centre of gravity of the Mothman story is the bridge disaster. You know, and John Keel ultimately came to feel that the communicating entities were ultimately evil. So for these guys, for the Hellier team, I would say any fault lines in your health, your sanity, your finances, your material stability, your relationships may be subject to eruption. You know, cultivate your consensus reality strength, because you can't anticipate where the hell these things might get difficult. You know, I wish them good luck in this. You know, I think this Robert Anton Wilson thing is a very significant resonance. And I also want to give a shout out to Psychic Questing, as developed by Andrew Collins and Graham Phillips in the late 70s in the UK. Now, maybe a lot of people over the other side of the pond in the US are familiar with Andy and Graham. They've been cropping up on Ancient Aliens. Andy's written some fantastic books about the likes of the Denisovans and Göbekli Tepe. But back in the 70s, Andy and Graham had got this whole approach together that they called psychic questing, which involved getting psychics out into the landscape, visiting strange sites, often under cover of darkness, interacting with spirit forms and entities, following visions and synchronicities to investigate mysteries, and often seemingly coming into contact with the bad guys, and some outrageous stuff, manifestations, very, very powerful manifestations came out of this. And questing had evolved out of ufology. And Andy had actually been the person who investigated the very first UK abduction case that dated from back in 1974, an absolute classic that linked the whole paranormal spectrum to ufology, by way of preparation for this thing. And his recent book, which I happen to know the Hellier team are having a look at the moment, Light Quest, was a USA guide to interacting with light and plasma phenomenon at various sites, including ancient mounds and so forth. He's been and done all this decades ago. And I was particularly fascinated to recall an episode just over 40 years ago where he and Graham Phillips had, another guy called Martin Keatman, had gone to Loch Ness to investigate the whole setup there, and they spent over a week there. And what they soon discovered, we know Loch Ness because of the monster stories, but in fact it's what they used to call a window area. There is a whole enormous spectrum of weirdness that's gone down there. There's a lot of ufological activity. There's even been Bigfoot and big cat sightings. There's been time slip experiences. People in old-fashioned clothes have suddenly appeared in thunderstorms, disorientated, and then disappeared again. And there's a huge, great fault line that runs along the whole of Loch Ness. And Andy and Graham were talking about the extent to which this geomagnetic phenomenon was in many respects actually helping this portal, this window to manifest. This is a theme that we get in Hellier when they're looking at the geomagnetic situation around the Somerset area, if I remember rightly. And of course, bottom line, this is not something they investigated, but this is where Crowley was. This is where Boleskine House was, still is just about. And it is, literally Mecca, the focal point for, Thelemic magic. You're supposed to orientate yourself in the direction of Boleskine, like you would the East or you would Mecca. So you basically got, the idea that the magical focal point of Crowley's New Eon is some kind of multi-dimensional window area for a whole wide spectrum of paranormal weirdness. Now, I did a whole section in my book, and there's a lecture of mine out on YouTube on Crowley and Loch Ness Monster. It's a fascinating thing, the Abramelin ritual that he was set up to do there, that he walked away from. There comes a point in that where you've got to invoke a bunch of these kind of demons, one of which is actually Leviathan, who's very much a sea monster. The stuff kicks in decades after he's left, but this and the manifestation of ideas like Cthulhu from tuned in artist writers like Lovecraft, this is all part of an eruption, from what you might call the daft tunnels of Set Zone, the averse tree. And I think that it's very, very instructional for the kind of things that the Hellier team are coming into contact and the kind of things that are brewing there. And if they become aware of this, it'd be very interesting to see what happens next, basically.
I hope there is a next. That's one thing that ought to be mentioned. I am hoping there's a third season, because this is, among other things, it is indeed itself a ritual which you can co-participate in. It's a ritual for them. There is an age gap in the occult and UFO community, and these are younger people doing some of the type of things that we were doing in the 1960s at a new level, and accurately documenting them in a way that hasn't been done before, which is one of my interests. I mean, these programs like Ghost Hunters and what was it called? UFO Hunters, whatever. I was on that program a couple of times, and they are theatrical, whereas the Hellier team has great production values, but is really the way it is in field investigations. I speak from personal experience. The concern that I have is sort of the same thing here. And I'm glad that somebody sees fit to bring up Kenneth Grant. He's more or less the Breeze OTO has succeeded in making Grant a lot less well known here than he might have been on this side of the pond. But the notion of the tunnels of Set, it even occurred to me that, you know, they were entering a mine shaft, and my concern is they will indeed at some point, in fact, it's predictable, at some point, reach out to something that is just feels out of their league. But of course, the design is the design of all initiations, which is to induce crisis, resolve it, and move on to a higher level, unless you get chased off. And that's the, you only have to have one weak link in the community that is doing the investigation to scare the entire community off. That's historically true. I don't want that to be true with the Hellier people, because I think what they're doing is really, really worthwhile, and I can't emphasize that enough. However, there is more to be done, and at some point they will reach that crisis. If they resolve it, they will move upward, and their audience will follow with them. If they don't, not only will that be a spiritual loss for them, but my hope that they represent a new generation of people who are not afraid to link UFOs and cryptids and tunnel creatures and whatever, and also to experience walking into the mythos, which is, you know, it seems to me self-apparent. If you watch in the middle of the first season, there's a sudden and non sequitur vision of a tin cup. And I have written Greg about this because I thought it was something that he should be aware of, rather than, you know, just holding it back. But I'm not a Christian, never have been, but I do think that if there was anything to the legend of the Last Supper, a probable Passover Seder, the cup of Jesus Christ, the Lord's cup, later to be called the Grail or the Holy Grail or the Grail, and setting off the entire Grail subset of the Arthurian cycle, would not be some extravagant, rich goblet. It would be something like a tin cup or a ceramic cup. And this vision is of a tin cup. Tin being an odd material, considering that Joseph of Arimathea allegedly went to Glastonbury to buy tin. He was a wealthy trader, apparently. And there were tin mines in Britain at that time. And that's part of that mythos as well. Okay, so they get to this mine shaft. They're still looking for, I don't know why the word goblins should be more than in quotes, because what those people that saw the original, you know, Hopkinsville goblins, that's just their word for something they didn't know what to call it. Maybe they were goblins, or maybe they were little green men, or maybe they were both, or neither. But it seems to me that when they got there, first of all, I have looked at that episode repeatedly where they find the actual tin cup. First thing I look for is to see whether it's a soup can or something, but there's no label on it. It is a tin cup. I thought it odd that they didn't bag and tag it right there, but they did go back in the second season, which means they went back later and did collect the actual cup. There's no other debris there. I looked at the floor and at the walls to see if there were graffiti elements or lots of trash in there, like this was a hangout place for the local teenagers, or local teenager, as the case may be. Hellier is a very small town, and the adjacent areas are all very rural. However, the tin cup of the vision is the tin cup in the mine shaft, and nothing else is there. And they come back, I don't know how many months later, and it's still there. So this is not a place that people go ordinarily, and there's nothing else there, and it's a plain tin cup. And I sent Greg Newkirk an image of a plain tin cup found in the Holy Land circa the time of, alleged time of Jesus. And it's, for all intents and purposes, identical. And I thought, well, if you want to have a particular mythos that they have moved into, it's the Grail mythos. And if it is, further back in the mine shaft, there be dragons. So, as I said on Hellier, don't try this at home. I just hope they don't get scared off.
Question about the alchemy of the team is that Connor, I think, is the guy who's really got ahead for the research. He mentions the fact that he's a Catholic, and he's also somebody who, at one point in the whole proceedings, he realises that where they are, he's discovered some of his family tree. He's walking in the footsteps of his ancestors. So that kind of continuity and that kind of background, to me, is a good predisposition towards what you're talking about. That has the capacity to come through because they've got somebody there who would be able to be a conduit for it. And yeah, it will work. But the 333 coding on the day that the whole thing is premiered really shows to me, the nature of what they will inevitably come up against.
Am I not correct that the 333 also came up on that flashing clock that was behind me? When
yes, I was going to say that. Yes.
I couldn't see that clock. I only saw the clock, when I sat down, and then I saw it when I saw Hellier, the interview with me. So
I think it was when they were talking about the third order, even, was when the 333 was flashing.
333 comes up. And then they said, does the number 31 mean anything to you? Because the number 31, what came up on that sheet that they got, they gave me a copy of it. I forget who sent it to them, but it was an important part that got them on the road, so to speak, which is always the important thing, the invitation to adventure. And I said, curiously enough, showing self-interest or whatever, I said, well, I edited the only authorized edition of Frater Codd's Liber 31, but I should have mentioned, well, yeah, it means a lot because it's the number of the Book of the Law, Liber al Vegas. Yeah.
Can I add something real quick?
You don't need my permission. I'm just the guy in Georgia.
Fair enough. So last night I was just jumping from source to source to look up random rabbit holes I wanted to discuss today. And then I just randomly found this. This is when I first heard Cleland mention synchronicity is the language they use to communicate. As the conversation progressed, Dolan and Cleland discussed how the number 333 seems to manifest in strange synchronicity to the phenomena. Cleland talked about how many abductees report waking up to see their clocks at exactly 3:33 a.m. And his research indicated that this is the time when the body, in its deepest sleep, is at its weakest and consequently nearest to death. He inferred a connection between abduction and near-death experiences. A parallel NDE researcher, Dr. Kenneth Ring, observed as well. In response, Dolan agreed that the number 333 was ubiquitous and said that all he had come up with was a possible Christian connection, and that it is exactly half of 666, seemingly implying a connection to the biblical number the beast from Revelation 13:8. Now that's from this weird Christian New Agey paranormal book about the Vatican called Exo Vaticana. It's like by Thomas Horn. So it's like half actual occult research, half missing the boat by a few miles because of a Christian interpretation type of look at things like the Lucifer telescope and, strange goings on about.
Remember, God never does the same thing twice. Seems to be a title of a book that I wrote very recently that people should buy. Therefore, 333 can have more than one mystical meaning. If it has an infinite number, then you're suspecting, well, there are an infinite number of numbers. But if it has several different levels of meaning, that doesn't mean that any of them are wrong. It means that they're sacred in different contexts. I mean, one of the critiques of the Book of the Law is thee and thou are used as if we were using King James English, which IWAS, the Preterhuman Intelligence that allegedly dictated it, would probably be disinclined to use. More likely would be to use the contemporary phrases, but someone who was born into and raised in the Plymouth Brethren, as Crowley was, Edward Alexander Crowley, would most likely use thee and thou, because that's King James English.
During that era too, that's what it would have been associated with, a really, deep spiritual text as well, because that was kind of the association people had with the King James English and that version of the Bible and so forth. Yeah,
that's true, but if you accept the religious polemic point of view, which I totally reject. I always say, can I use a curse word here?
Absolutely.
Okay. What the world doesn't need is another goddamn religion. Okay, we've got religions coming out our wazoo. That's not a dirty word, and we just don't need another one. So when Thelema started to become a religious movement, that was when I started to depart from it. I see it as a philosophical notion of the Gnostic Mass. I see it as a mystery play, not as a religious rite, and that's the group that I joined sort of presented it in that way, I think earnestly, and I don't know that any of the people that were in the Euless Lodge number 10 OTO Incorporated are still in the Breeze OTO. I just don't think they are. The corporate OTO, as I call it, rightly, I think. It was presented in a different way back then, in the circa 1981, 82, and I saw it change gradually. But as I said, I believe the changes were built in. Crowley had ambiguous feelings about religion, period, and he had days when he was an atheist, days when he was a Satanist, and somewhere very much in a different category altogether on other days, mostly when the heroin and the hashish were kicking in real good. So, and right after he had sex with everybody in Kefaloon. When I say everybody, I mean everybody except Jane Wolfe.
Well, we got to wrap things up here pretty soon, but there was one last.
It's over.
Well, poor Paul. Paul, it's like what?
I didn't even put out my little bottle in case I had to use my motorman's grin, because I'm old, and I didn't want to walk away to.
Well, I know, but I haven't had any dinner yet all day, actually, and I think poor Paul. It's 2 in the morning in the UK or something there. But
I think it's gonna melt, Alan.
I'm much more loquacious at 2 a.m., but I understand. Most people, they are not vampires, and I'm not a vampire.
It sounds like
come here.
Interesting to end on here. In the final episode, they are looking at the Freight Rackhead book, and they have got the 31 and so forth, and they're clear about this. But what they don't say, whether it's lost in the edit or whether they're just not fully cognizant of it, is that Akkad's work there is the foundation of what decades later becomes the cracking of the code that is the secret cipher, the Youthful. Maybe Alan can say a few words about that, because how this evolves and how it comes about is quite a fascinating thing in its own right.
Well, what people do with the cipher will be very helpful to them, whatever they do. You know, if it's the name of the town, I had no idea what that town was where allegedly Indrid Cold wound up. I ran the name Indrid Cold, but I didn't know what the name of the town was. I thought it was in West Virginia, and it turns out that it's not. But I would run the name of the town, because that will lead you to further clues, the next phase, the next going on. So I hope they do work with the complete secret cipher of the Euphonauts, which includes secret rituals of Men in Black, assuming Men in Black have rituals and secrets. But I do think that these people, what I've said to them, the first thing, I mean, I'm not trying to, talk down to them. They are live wires, and I'm just this old guy sitting here in front of my computer looking at my own face and how gray my hair has got. At least I have most of my hair, all of my hair. It's amazing. All of my sons have gone bald, go figure. But in any case, I do think that they need, the first thing that struck me was they need to take a spelunker with them if they're going in caves, or especially mine shafts, especially abandoned mine shafts. And they need to have someone outside who knows they're there. They need to wear helmets. They need to take equipment. I told them, please see the movie The Descent. I want it just to scare you, because you need to have a certain amount of caution in these matters for totally practical reasons, like cave-ins. Now, you might die down there, but first you'll see the Pope. That has happened, but appearing as a manifestation. That was actually the miracle that got, what was it, the Pope John Paul, which Pope was it that was made a saint, because that was his second miracle. The two miners that were eventually rescued but were down in the dark for a long time until they saw the Pope opening a door, and then they were rescued.
Word.
Well, I don't think it could have been the first John Paul, because he was actually only the Pope for 33 days, if I remember correctly, before.
No, it wasn't. It definitely wasn't. And I'm not even sure that he even, had settled in. That was. I was living in Tucson at the time, and I was in graduate school, and I walked into the local food bar, and it said the Pope is dead, and I thought, this newspaper must be a week old. Well, it was just a different Pope. He'd only lasted a couple of weeks. So.
Yeah.
I think it was John the 23rd, maybe, or I don't know. I'm not, as I said, that's. Well, I admire the persistence of the papacy, but it's nice to have all of that apostolic succession that are on my begots page, if anybody wants to know. It's free to all, free, little birds, fly away.
One last thing I wanted to get into before we wrapped up here, kind of on your note of caution for the Hellier researchers, and this was something I had in regards to some of the source material that they were using. Specifically, there were two authors specifically I didn't feel like they had really given full disclosure on. One was Jim Brandon, which is a pseudonym, I believe, for William Grimstead, I think, the author of The Rebirth of Pan, and George Hunt Williamson. Is in regards to Brandon, I mean, he has quite a history of anti-Semitism. He's been a longtime associate of Michael A. Hoffman, who certainly has a pretty extensive history of debatable opinions on the Jews and so forth. And then, of course, George Hunt Williamson had the ties to William Dudley Paley and, all of this kind of stuff. For those of you who are unaware, Paley was the head of the Silver Shirts, which was kind of a fascist movement in the United States leading up to the Second World War. Yeah, well, it was pretty much a full
My
blown.
father and the local rabbi in my hometown infiltrated the Silver Shirts. They weren't kind of.
Yeah. I should probably not the best one there, but yeah, I mean, he was imprisoned, I believe, for 5 years during the war years, essentially on suspicion of being a Nazi spy. So he was pretty hardcore, let's just say that. But I mean, that was one of the few things that kind of upset me a little bit about them. It was like, shouldn't some of this stuff be disclosed essentially when we're getting into it? Because I mean, there is definitely, I would say, a bit of a dark side to both Williamson and especially Brandon and some of their other activities outside of the UFO field or the rebirth of Pan and that type of thing. Both Paul, Allen, I think both of you guys would have great opinions on this.
Let me just say this. Ezra Pound was a great poet. The fact that he was a fascist doesn't change the fact that he was a great poet.
Yeah, I don't want to say
means he was a morally corrupt human being.
Yes.
George Williamson was an interesting person. I wouldn't have dinner with him, but I have read his books. And I ran I think a 4 or 5 part series on my Facebook page just recently on fascist occultism. And I do believe the modern occult movement, especially the New Agey type occult movement, has a lot of its origins in the Guy Ballard, Pelly, George Adamski, who was an anti-Semite according to Jim Mosley, who knew him and was his expose guy, and Adamski, of course, one of his witnesses was George Hunt Williamson. That doesn't mean that Other Tongues, Other Flesh isn't a significant book. They ought to know about these things, but there are other things I think that are probably even more important. What they need to know is if there's something anti-Semitic or anti-Black or racist or fascistic or something in something that they're relying on. But if they're relying on just, books that don't relate to that particular point of view at all, unless you think Other Tongues, Other Flesh is some sort of euphemism for not Jews.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to suggest that it invalidates the work that, the Rebirth of Pan and, Williamson's work on UFOs and whatnot. I mean, certainly it is very compelling. I just kind of felt like, well, there should maybe be a little bit of disclosure about, where these guys were coming from, essentially, what their other activities had been, that type of thing.
Well, they did consult with me, and they did consult with Tinney.
I'm not even so sure that they would even be aware. They're so deluged with information and they're so rummaging around in absolutely everything that it's quite possible that they would not even know that there was that background to these people.
That's
future
almost certainly not. They don't impress me as political people, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Not in these overly polarized days. I mean, that's just my Facebook page used to have lots and lots of political stuff on it. It has none since 2016. I had done with things after that election. I'm sorry. That was a slip of my Freud.
It was a Freudian slip there. Yeah.
Slip of the Freud, I call it. I do run things on fascist occultism and have attracted some of the few people who have done political analysis there. But more important to me for the work that they're doing now is that they have a spelunker along, they have somebody outside, and they also have somebody who's a really, really good occultist with them. Because the level of experience, I don't want them to get scared off. And maybe they won't. Maybe I do know that early in my occult career, way back when the dinosaurs ruled the earth, I tried an experiment that was beyond my pay grade, and it scared the bejesus out of me. It didn't stop my interest, but it might have. I was scared to death. It's early 1970s. I was just telling my girlfriend about this Wednesday night, I think it was. And it was a chastening experience that somebody mentioned the Lord of the Abyss, whose name I do not say. That's what I encountered. It was way beyond my pay grade, and there was nothing whatever that I could have done. But it had an effect on me of being humbling. But I do know lots of people in ufology, in the occult world, etc., etc. Even some cryptozoologists that get a little too close to Bigfoot or the abominable snowman, as they used to call the Yeti, and it scares them off. But other people, it galvanizes them, and I'm hoping for the latter, praying for the latter, actually. So,
That's all. And I guess one last question. Okay, for both Alan and Paul, you guys can both weigh in this. Do you see Hellier as being a harbinger of the new Aeon that we're entering into, or have already entered into?
yes.
Paul?
I'm hoping, but yes.
I think it has the flavour of the distinctive qualities of the new Eon. You know, it's an expression of the Eon that is already in motion. Yeah, and as I say, it's very, very distinctive 21st century forms. So it shows that powerful forces are working through our distinctive cultural forms at this moment.
Well, that's fabulous. I want to thank you guys very much for coming in here. I mean, this has been just a great conversation, very insightful. I've definitely learned a lot. I'm sure Frank could say the same thing.
Agreed, very much so. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, I think this has been tremendous. And free Scotland.
Oh, man, that's great. All right, well, let's wrap it up then.
All right, everybody. Well, thanks for listening and have a good night. And we'll be back next week with something wonderful, probably also related to Hellier. We'll update you.